All right, let's start today's talk number 24, which I've titled A First Attempt, and I really do mean that, a first attempt at formulating a bringer of justice model. And I've put over here on this side what I think of as my bringer of justice model. And I will come back and work on that along the way, but I want to lead up to that. Now, let me just warn you at the beginning of this talk that now we're moving up a bit into the abstractness of the things. We've done narrative, we've done some literary analysis, we've done a little bit of social background, but not as much as we should do and as we will do. And now we've come sort of to what we're aiming at, and that's biblical theology, where we try to piece the pieces together and ask, what does God teach us in His narrative and in His law, that's as far as we've gotten, about justice? Now, I'm not going to really do a complete summary of that, but what I am going to do is to present a model to do that, and I just want to warn you in advance that it's abstract, and it's a little difficult, and it will stretch you a little bit, and it's a little hard to follow. I have read the notes twice, and of course I wrote them myself, and I'm confused. I just reread them a few minutes ago, and I said, oh dear, there's some things that need to be straightened out, but I'll do that this afternoon after I take my nap. The other thing that's different about this talk than the other ones, the other talks have been embedded in the story, in the narrative. This talk could theoretically be done at a number of junctures. So I've stepped outside the narrative framework. This talk could have been done a bit earlier. It probably would have been better to do it later, but I wanted to do it now before we break and come back for another series of 12. All right, if you have your notes, I'm going to read these, and I don't like reading. I mean, that's the worst possible form. I will try to read them intelligently, and if I see you falling asleep, I will try to tell a joke. And I will do a little drawing on the board, which I hope is redemptive. I want to start by reviewing two parts, the star of justice and then the task of justice. We've talked about those, and then feed them into the model. So I've really got three things going. I've got the star of justice going, which is a conceptual thing. It is a model, but it's a mini model. Then we've got the task of justice, which we've talked about along the way, and that's a piece of the larger bringer of justice model. So what I want to do today is to assemble the pieces into a whole. I have not had much success in incorporating the drawings in the notes, so you don't have them in the notes. We'll try to have them on the website. So if you can draw a star, that would be helpful. Now I can actually draw a star myself since I have the board, and I will draw a star and help you think about this. The star of justice has 5 points and a center. And I've recently bought a number of new books on justice. I already have 200 or 300, but you know, there's always a new one coming out. And the first thing I always ask when I look at a new book, and I've recently bought a spate of books on forgiveness, and they all talk about justice, and some of them talk about justice and forgiveness. The first thing I look for is to see, how do they define their terms? How do they use the term justice? And everybody talking about justice isn't talking about the same thing, all right? So I want to be very clear about how I'm using my term justice. I don't claim that it's the only way to do it. I'm not even sure that it's completely the right way to do it. I hope that it is comprehensive. Now, I've really tried to be comprehensive. I've tried to read the text, pay attention, and to make sure that all the text that talks about justice shows up in one way or the other in the star of justice. So if there are bits of justice lying about in the Bible that don't fit into the star, I don't know what I will have to do, invent a 6-pointed star or go to something else. But I'm using that. And so I encourage you, when you think about justice, when you read about justice, which part of justice are they talking about? Are they aware of the other parts of justice? How do they put them together? How do they see them coming together? At the top is forensic justice, which involves the judge making judicial decisions. So up here is forensic. And the person doing that is obviously the judge. He's making courtroom decisions. And there's a good deal of that in the Bible. But it may be that this point needs to be broadened to include God as ruler, not so much as judge, but as king. Obviously, in the ancient world, the king was the supreme judge, so it may be that we should think of God as king, ruling over the universe, with his role of judge, handing out judicial decisions as a facet of that. So it could be that king is the broader, and that instead of handing out judgments or judging, that the even broader concept would be ruling. Now, let me just simply say that there's a technical discussion going on here in the Hebrew word shapat and mishpat about whether it means to judge or to rule, and you can see that in some of the footnotes when I finally get them up. I rather think that probably the broader concept is there. If you make it too broad, it begins to lose its edge, but I suspect that breadth is there, and people have therefore also said that the creation of the world by the king was a creating and ruling activity, and they put that ordering, watch how I'm using the language, they put that ordering of the universe as a justice activity. Now, I'm very attracted by that, because that strengthens what I've tried to find about justice up here front, all right? I'm very attracted by that. They use Psalms, and that's why I've not discussed it with you, as their proof text. I'm not very convinced of the proof texts. And unfortunately, the only book that deals with this in any depth is in German. So you're not likely to go home and read it. And neither am I, for that matter. All right, on the left 2 points of the star, I write standard and conduct. And you've seen me do this before. Standard and conduct. And let me read you my sentence. I've tried to craft this so that I hope it's right. On the left 2 points of the star, write standard, which is the law. Now, there'll be more standard, but that's the standard we're dealing with now. And conduct. One is righteous. That would be a pronouncement by the judge. One is righteous if one's conduct conforms to the standard. So if the judge sees one conducting oneself in accordance with the standard of the law in this case, then the judge pronounces one to be a righteous person. And we've actually seen that happen with Abraham. Abraham believed God, and God said, that was right behavior. You're righteous. Which I do not take as a justification statement, but as simply a declaration of what he indeed is. So the law, standards are context sensitive and are always set within relationships. And there's an enormous discussion about that in the literature, and I've compressed it into one sentence. I do accept that standards are context sensitive and are always set within relationships. So the law is a matter of a treaty context, which we've not really come to. That's Exodus 24, and we'll get to that, in which the stipulations of the law are given by God to his people with whom he has established a relationship. So God, at Exodus 24, after the giving of the law, they say, we accept the stipulations, and God says, you're my people, and they enter into a treaty relationship. And we'll come back in another set of lectures and spell out how that treaty relationship works and what it looks like. And these standards of the law are focused in Israel. The focus of God's standards in the story, since Abraham onwards, has been on what becomes Israel, that is, insiders. We must ask as we go along, what standard is required of outsiders who are not in covenant relationship with the Lord? And that's sort of a difficult and dangerous territory. But I started these lectures 30, 40 years ago as a missionary, and so you can see the missionary questions coming in. What about the people who don't know the law of God? What about the people who don't know the Scriptures? What's God going to do with them? Well, the answer is he's going to be just. But if you want to press the details, and I think most of us always want to press that a little bit, we will ask that question as we go along. On the right side of the star, 2 points, write retributive justice and distributive justice. And we've done this before. Retributive justice, distributive justice. And let me remind you that these are not my terms. These are stock terms drawn from the world of philosophy and biblical studies, which I think has borrowed them from philosophy. And I'm not sure if jurisprudence follows these or not. That's a bit beyond my range of knowledge. But these are stock terms. I don't particularly like them, but I suspect inventing other terms would be cumbersome. And so I'm staying with the stock terms and defining them as I go along. Retributive justice has to do with executing of punishment as the result of the judge making a forensic pronouncement, a verdict of guilty. So if the judge finds somebody's conduct to not be in conformity to the law, then he pronounces them guilty and executes retributive justice on them. He punishes them. Did you see how all the facets came together in that move? Shall I say it again? That the judge finds the defendant, the conduct of the defendant, measured by the law to be less than adequate. He's broken the law. And so the judge then pronounces that person to be guilty, which is a forensic statement, and he receives punishment, which is a form of retributive justice. Distributive justice has to do with the restoration of the victims of injustice to health, wholeness, and community. It is this latter facet of justice that often is missed out in theological constructs. And I am not a lawyer, although I'm the son of a lawyer, so I get some of this osmotically. My guess is that it is within Western jurisprudence that this is a gaping hole in Western jurisprudence as well. But I could be wrong about that. But it's certainly the sort of thing that one ought to think about if one's profession is law. Finally, in the center of the star, we write fair. Now, unfortunately, when you ask people about justice and you say, what is it? You usually get a one-answer word, which is fair, which is absolutely correct, and it's right on target. But it's not the whole concept. Just being fair is not being just. You have to be fair in relation to the conduct and the standard and to the judge, and you have to take in retribution and distribution. And fair here, then, is adverbial to all these and says the judge does not accept bribes, that the retribution has to be handed out eye for eye, tooth for tooth on an equal sort of basis, that the standard has to be a standard that's uniform, not one standard for the rich, as we saw in the Code of Hammurabi, and another standard for the middle class and the poor. That doesn't really work. And you can't measure conduct for one gender one way and for another gender the other way. So fairness has to modify all of these. And of course, this is where we all start in our thinking of justice. We think of it as being fairness, which is absolutely true, but that's only the beginning. So the judge must not take a bribe. A witness must speak the truth about conduct of the accused, the 9th commandment. Retributive justice must be handed out fairly. We struggled, at least I struggled, with the 2nd commandment clause, which says, he will punish the children for the sins of the fathers to the 3rd and the 4th generation. The reason why I struggled with that is it doesn't sound like God's fair, right? And if we are willing to admit it, all the way through the Bible, people are saying, God, is this fair? And sometimes they change the punctuation from a question mark to an exclamation, and they say, this is not fair. Huh? And we'll see them say that. Just wait till we get to the Psalms, every other page. God is not, and God incorporates this into his book. So that gives us permission to ask questions and say things to which we should be driven for a biblical answer. At least that's the way I would take these things to be. The standard, the laws must be just. and we will come in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 4 to a statement, they made unjust laws. Must not be one law for one class and another law for another class. We've already talked about that. All right, so much for the Star of Justice. Now, I'll take questions and comments and insights at the end, so write them down as you go along if you've got a question about this. This is fundamental. And by and by, I will hand it out to you in a larger chart with all of the English terms that pertain to each area. So there are about 10 terms for standard. All right? And I will also hand out a chart with all those terms in Hebrew and their Greek translation. So you can see this begins to be a project, doesn't it? Some smart young person could get at least one PhD, if not two, by sticking this all together. All right? 2, if you'll be that person, I'll find you a scholarship, huh? Of course, it'll take you 10 years, but never mind. Review of the task of justice. Now, let me remind you where the task of justice is. It comes over here in the Bringer of Justice chart, the task. And I will come back and work on this chart, but we've already looked at the task, and so now I'm going to rehearse that and then come back and review the rest of the chart with you. So you already know about the task, so I'm going to start there where you already are. And I'm going to relate this task of justice to the larger storyline so that we see how it fits in that and interpret it within that storyline. So the task of the Bringer of Justice flows from the programmatic texts. The task in the Bringer of Justice model directly flows from the programmatic words spoken by God to Adam and Eve about being fruitful and increasing so as to subdue and rule the earth. This is Genesis 1:28. And there's something to be thought about there that we as evangelicals haven't thought about. In fact, the liberals haven't thought about it either. There's a couple doctoral dissertations that have been published in the last 2 years on this text, but they haven't gone very far with it, and they haven't traced its impact through the rest of the Scriptures, so it's worth thinking about. And he not only spoke programmatic words, but also from the programmatic picture. I've had to change my jargon a little bit. I hope you won't get off ship with me. Programmatic picture of Adam and Eve at the climax. So we've got a programmatic word here. On day 6, he says, be fruitful and multiply and increase and subdue the earth and rule it, which I take to be the statement of the image of God. The image of God in humans is creativity. And here you see it. And then on day 2, the apex, the very last thing that God says, in verse 24 and 25 of chapter 2, very last thing he says was, Adam and Eve were there and they were naked and did not know shame. So they were a naked society, and I've understood that to be a just society. They were open with each other. And so we have a programmatic words and a programmatic picture that tell us at the beginning of creation that God's goal for the world is a just society. Now let me say that again, because I'm going to work that hard today. God's goal for the world is the formation on earth of a just society, and he does not change his mind when humans get in trouble. He doesn't say, we're going to have to go to plan B now. No, he's still on target with just society, and we'll see that in just a second here. Let me read on a little bit now. God worked with humankind in judgment and mercy to achieve his goal of establishing on earth a just society. The judgments are seen in the banishment of Adam and Eve from the garden, the flood, which destroyed all but 8 persons, and the confusion of the language at the Temple of Babel. And so we've already seen that we had judgment here, judgment at the flood, judgment at Babel. And the word judge is not used, or judgment, but the activity is very clear. It's done in pictorial narrative language, and we see that. God's desire for humankind to be fruitful and increase is repeated to Noah after the flood. So this has not gone out of business. And so at Genesis 9, 1 and 7, it's repeated verbatim and even expanded a little bit. And God's saying, I'm still on target with this business about being fruitful and increasing and multiplying and subduing and taking care of the earth. Now, Noah, get on with it. So God's desire for humankind to be fruitful and increase is repeated to Noah after the flood, and later taken up into the programmatic promise of Genesis 12, 2 and 3 made to Abraham, that God will make him a great nation, read society, and through that nation, society, bring blessing to all the families of the earth. So we have a response of mercy here, a response of mercy here, and then the big mercy that comes is God selects Abraham and Sarah and says to them in Genesis 12, 2 and 3, I am going to bless you, I'm going to make of you a great nation, and through you all the families on earth will be blessed. And I take that text to be absolutely central. Now you say, how about this text? My answer is that this text is taken up into that text. You say, where do you see that? I see it at the bottom of page 1 on the notes. You can also find it in Genesis 48:4. But I will read it to you from the notes with one typographical error that I caught early this morning. Jacob, this is one of these internal quotes, Jacob, who's about to die, said to Joseph, they're in Egypt of course, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me, and he said to me, I'm going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. Do you hear it? Huh? It's Genesis 1:28. I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give you this land as a possession for you. So the Genesis 1:28 promise is taken up in a repetition of the Genesis 12 promise, and so it's incorporated in that. And so God has not revoked that or gone back on that. He's simply taken that up into the promise to Abraham, and he says, let us go forward with that. Or to put it a bit more abstractly, bottom of page 1, let me make the same point with different wording. God's creational intention, that's what this is, God's creational intention to create on earth a just society that will be fruitful and multiply and rule the world. God's creational intention of establishing a just society on earth that will be fruitful and increase and care for the world is taken up into the covenantal intention expressed in the promise to Abraham and to Sarah. This repetition of be fruitful and increase and the programmatic promise made to first to Abraham are acts of mercy which follows the judgment. From this programmatic promise made to Abraham flow all that God is going to do to restore humankind. Now, I'm simply saying that. I haven't demonstrated that. Can I read the sentence again? But it is my central thesis. From this programmatic promise, which has been nuanced and taken up, and will be nuanced a bit more in the time of David and then Jeremiah and then Jesus, but it's the same promise that keeps getting update. If you think Microsoft with its 3.1, 4.2, 5.6, no, this was God's idea, the idea of versions, right? And so it keeps getting update and they keep selling you a new package, but it's the same old Microsoft, isn't it, with the same old word. And so this gets revised, but I think the central statement remains throughout. From this programmatic promise made to Abraham, flow all that God is doing to restore humankind. So the goal is to get back to here. They lost it here, and God restarts the system here. He actually restarts it here, but for our purposes we'll say he restarts it here. And out of this promise flows everything that God is going to do to bring us back to there. The end of the story and the beginning of the story are almost identical in terms of their verbiage and their imagery. And eventually we will get to that sort of thing. Now the task. The task in the promise is to make a just society which carries forward God's creational intention. This just society, and here I'm going to use a word that I hope works for you, that this just society he's making is the proximate goal, and it is also the means to the ultimate goal. Now let me see if I can make this clear. that God promises Abraham he'll make of him a great nation. That's the proximate, that's the near goal, the at-hand goal. But this goal then becomes the means by which he reaches his ultimate goal, and the ultimate goal is that Abraham and his seed would be a blessing to all the families of the earth. All right? And by, a long time from now, Peter will stand up on a second sermon, he'll look at the Jews, he'll cite this passage verbatim, and he'll say, you see that God has fulfilled his goal by sending to us Jesus in fulfillment of, and then he cites the promise. Acts chapter 3, but we're not there, that's outside the story. So I'm suggesting now that the way this goal works out is God will first build the nation Israel, that's his proximate goal, but in the building of that nation in itself then becomes the means to the ultimate goal, which is to bless all the families of the earth. Israel's ultimate mistake was to think that they were the ultimate goal. Israel's ultimate mistake is to think that they were the ultimate goal, when all along God's intention for Israel was to make them the means by which he would bring blessing. And you could transfer that to church, and I think it would still be a true sort of statement. All right. The single goal of God, as is evident from both the creational intention and the covenantal intention, is to create a just society on earth that will be fruitful and increase and care for the earth. This goal is achieved in two steps, and I've already said this, I'm simply repeating it. The proximate goal is to make of Abraham a great, holy, and just nation. We've seen the greatness, the multiplication. We've come to the justice part. We find that in the law. The holy part we will get to as a maintenance mechanism. The goal for God's people is not to be holy, it's for them to be just. The way to keep them just is to make them holy. And in the next round of lectures, I will explain the interrelationship of holiness to justice and spell that out in 6 or 7 maintenance mechanisms which you find in the Pentateuch. So his proximate goal is to make of Abraham a great, holy, and just nation society through whom, that is the means, he will bless all the families on earth, making it possible for them to be part of his people, his ultimate goal. Now, I started this 40 years ago as a series of lectures on mission theology. And then I moved to theology of poverty. And now I've moved on to justice. But I haven't left those others behind. I've simply picked them up and brought them along, all right? So my interest here is missions as much as it is justice, and I don't put them in different compartments. And I hope this sort of thinking will help people think about what to do with the poor people, right? I'll say that a bit later also as we go on. I've given you a diagram in the middle of page 2. I suspect that this diagram, well, maybe that diagram's not clear. I don't know. Oh, well. It started out pretty clear. But you see that there, and I'm trying to grasp this diagram. Now, let me read you the sentence under the diagram. It's worth the price of the lecture if there's any truth in this. There is only a single goal. Now, it's going to take us the rest of the Bible to establish that as valid, but up to this point, I think it's valid. There is only a single goal. God does not have two goals. The proximate goal and the ultimate goal are not two differing goals. The single goal is the creation of a just society on earth of the people of God that will be fruitful and increase and care for the world. All right? So the proximate goal is a people of God. They'll be fruitful and multiply and care for the world. The ultimate goal is a people of God that will be fruitful and multiply and care for the world. So there's not two goals. There's just a single goal. But there's two steps in getting to that goal. There's a proximate goal, and then there's the ultimate goal. I wonder if you see that I'm trying to answer, at least the beginning of an answer, to the question we asked about 10 talks ago, why Israel? And I'm not asking why Israel and why not Egypt. I'm asking why any nation at all? which happens to be Israel. Why didn't God just fast forward from the garden up to the cross and skip all that other stuff? It would have saved all of us a lot of time, and it would have saved a lot of trees. Right? Yeah, I mean, the Old Testament, you have to cut down a lot of trees for the Old Testament. And God could have been very green and saved us a lot of trees if He had simply skipped the Old Testament, as we call it, or the story of Israel. Why Israel? And here's the beginning, I think, of the answer of why Israel, what God is trying to do with Israel. Task leads to the formation of a just society. God has chosen to reach His ultimate goal by means of His proximate goal, the formation of a just society called Israel. I'm repeating myself a bit here. The ultimate goal is that all the families on earth will be blessed. They will be blessed by having the opportunity of becoming a part of the people of God. There's a footnote in very small print, so small you can't read it and ask questions about it. How is that just society formed? Besides the Lord's call of Abraham and His promise to Abraham and His instruction to Abraham to teach his own children to walk in the way of the Lord by doing justice and righteousness, we must now add what the Lord has done to make Israel a just society, and He's done two things to start with, and then a third one added. The first thing He did was the Lord, through Moses, performed mighty acts of justice on behalf of Israel, which we call the Exodus. So the task now, the first part is He performed mighty acts of justice, both retributive and distributive. And these are manifest primarily at the Exodus, although you do have them at the Red Sea, and obviously when they take the land, we'll have yet another series of them. So the first thing that God does in forming a just society at this point in the story, or as He takes it further, is bringing them out of Egypt, bringing them out of slavery. The second thing He does is once He gets them out of Egypt and gets them to Mount Sinai, He proclaims the law and the tabernacle, the instructions for setting up the tabernacle. Now, we've been looking at the law, and we haven't even quite finished our study of the law. In the next series of 12 lectures, I will finish up some of the case study law, and then I will look at law as constitution, which is very controversial and powerful and right at the heart of things. And then when we finish that up, I will move on to ask about the tabernacle, which I would take to be the place for obtaining justice. The tabernacle is the place for obtaining justice, and in the next series of talks, I will try to unpack that for you a bit. Now, these two come together, and I've drawn this a little too large, but when they come together, the result is the formation of a just society. So these two come together to form that, and all of this has to be done justly. All right? So that's the task of justice. All three facets of this task, performance, proclamation, formation of a just society, to be done justly. So, for example, the law was proclaimed to men, to women, to children, aliens without distinctions. We have argued in some detail about the punishing of the children for the sins of idolatry of their fathers to the third and fourth generation. I've already mentioned that, but you get the idea. Next line down, 2.4. The just society of Israel is the means to the ultimate goal. We have already stated that the formation of Israel is the proximate goal of God. This proximate goal of the formation of a just society of Israel in turn becomes the means to His ultimate goal of bringing blessing to all the families of the earth, which implies that they too might become just societies and part of the people of God. Our suggestion is that Israel brings blessing to all the families of the earth by means of all three facets of the task of justice: performance of the mighty acts, proclamation of justice in the law and in the tabernacle, along with the resultant formation of Israel as a just society, with all of these done justly. This three-pronged, then I'll call this now a three-pronged, this three-pronged task forms a single witness to the character of God. So I would understand this not as three tasks, but this is a single task that has three distinguishable but not separable parts. They're distinguishable, but they're not separable. That means they shouldn't be separated, is what I, of course, mean to say. This three-pronged task forms a single witness to the character of the Lord to all the families of the earth. And as a result of that witness, then they come to believe. If I can, that's a bit crowded, but over here, if you have the three-pronged task here, then people outside will see this because it is a witness to them, and they will believe, and they will respond to that witness, and they themselves will become the people of God and form a just society. The nations will come to know the true and living God through the single witness that is given by Israel. This does not mean that the individual facets of the task of justice are not in themselves witnesses to the nation. We have already seen that the mighty acts of justice performed by the Lord at the Exodus were indeed a powerful witness to the Lord's character. And those who might have heard, they would not have read, they didn't have a copy of the Torah, part or even all the law, would recognize that it stood in stark contrast, broadly speaking, to the laws of the ancient Near East and to the other society. However, the greatest witness will be the formation of Israel as a just society as a result of the mighty acts of justice and the proclamation of an obedience to the law. So, the real power, or the full power, or the maximum power of the witness does not come just through the mighty acts, although they do have power, nor just through the proclamation of the law, although in contrast to the ancient Near Eastern laws, it does have some power. But it's when these two come together and form a society, and not just hypothetically, but a real society. This is Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 1 through 8 in practice now. They've actually obeyed the law, and they've become this just society. Then the real power is there. So the real power, or the maximum power, the full power of the witness of Israel only comes when all three aspects are fully in play and are taken together, and Israel, as a society composed of individuals in obedience to the law, which provides both social structure and personal guidelines. So the power of witness to the outsiders only comes when all these are working together and you actually have a just society formed. Then all three working together, distinguishable but not separable, they form a witness to the outsiders who then can see that. I can see your eyes are beginning to glaze over, so let's take a bit of a deep breath, because if you get this, you've got it all. You might as well go to sleep. This is the punchline, so I will read it again. All right, and it's taken me 40 years to get here, so I'll give you 40 seconds to breathe deeply and catch up. If this is even 10% true, if this is even 10% true, it really means we need to deeply and profoundly rethink what we're doing as the people of God. And I say that very carefully, and I'm on that trajectory. I'm not pushing you there, I am pushed. And this comes out of not sitting at Oxford or Cambridge and thinking abstractly about what God might be doing. No, this comes from ending up in the Philippines in a village of 11.5 million people, where 9 million of those people in that village lived on less than $1 a day, and a good number of them were within smelling range of my house. And I lived right there for 6 years, and I understood enough of the language to enter into relationship with some of those people and to realize that my inherited theology simply would not work. It was completely and utterly inadequate to speak to the massive poverty, not to mention evil spirits and sickness and corruption, all of which was fueled by injustice. That my theology that I had so carefully put together in all the best schools that we have funded and sent our children to, me included, that it simply wouldn't work. And so I'm on a personal journey. Someone said to me, "You're doing this for yourself, aren't you?" You bet. Absolutely. If I wasn't doing it for myself, I certainly wouldn't be doing it. It's too much work. I'm doing it, and I get up every morning because I'm driven by the fact that at 70 years of age, I still don't quite get it. Right? Why is it that the gospel simply has not penetrated Buddhist societies? Why is it that Japan is impregnable? Why is it that the Muslim community doesn't have converts? And I would think also we ought to ask a corollary, and why is it that the younger generation of Americans, the postmoderns, are slipping off the shelf very, very quickly? And I think part of the answer, I don't think it's the whole, but I think part of the answer is we've misunderstood what God is doing. And we've behaved inadequately. I wouldn't say wrongly, but inadequately. But a part truth, spoken as the whole truth, is untruth. You know that, don't you? And we've got hold of part of the truth, but what we really need to do is get hold of the whole truth and not just speak it, but try to live by it. And so this, the real power of witness, I mean, here I'm a missionary. I'm thinking missions, all right? And I'm thinking, why doesn't the gospel work in Thailand? The missionaries have been there almost 200 years, and less than 0.5% of the Thais are Christians. Why doesn't it work? They've built hospitals, they've built schools, they've done evangelism, they've done all the right things, they've shown the Jesus movie. It doesn't work. Why not? Why doesn't it work? Well, I'm not quite sure, and I'm not approaching this anthropologically, I'm approaching it theologically, and my hunch is that the full power of the witness of what God is doing only comes when all three aspects of this mighty acts, proclamation, and a just society that's just, not just in its interpersonal relations, personal ethics, but just in its structures. And that's when we get to the Constitution of Israel, that's what we'll talk about, in its structures. Because it's the structures that people will really see. How do the people of God structure themselves? And that's where the power comes. Now, let me just step outside the story for 1 second and say, I understand that sentence that I just read to you to be the central thesis of Acts 1 through 15. Can I say that again? I understand the sentence I just read to you about the three prongs working together to form one powerful witness. I understand that to be the central thesis of Acts 1 through 15. I also understand that to be the explanation as to why the disciples, who clearly heard the Great Commission, they were there, right? They clearly heard the Great Commission. Why for 20 years they didn't do anything about it. Or to put it the other way around, for 20 years they did everything about it. They got this right first, and then AD 50, then they went out and it worked. But it took them 20 years to think about what God had done for them and get those three things in place, and then the gospel exploded and took the world by surprise. All right? Now I've gone and told you what I'm going to do in the book of Acts, and you won't even have to come. You can just sit out in the hall and drink coffee. All right, now the bringer of justice model, and the clock is running faster than I am, and I don't think I can talk any faster. So take a dig. This has all been prolegomena, huh? And now we come to the bringer of justice model. The bringer of justice model is a matter of biblical theology, and we've worked at these levels, the narrative level, the literary level, the social world level. Now we're at the biblical theology level. Biblical theology uses the vocabulary of the text and seeks to reflect the contours of the text as much as possible. By contours, I have in mind the narrative, literary, and social elements just named above. One could have other topics besides justice at the level of biblical theology. One could do, and I own 2 copies of different books, the Biblical Theology of Idolatry. I own 5 copies of Biblical Theology of Holiness. I have 2 on Biblical Theology of Community. Governance, most people don't go there. Poverty, there are a few, but not any comprehensive ones. Ethnicity, the PhD group at NEGST has been doing that. Obviously, some topics are broader than others. Justice is a broad topic. If the topic is too broad, then the study is hard to focus and to manage. I wouldn't try a biblical theology of God or man, although people do that. Biblical theology is an exercise, now I'm going to introduce a metaphor that I hope is helpful, in map making. So what this is over here, this is a map. And I had thought to bring along a map today, but I forgot to do that. Do you like maps? Do you like maps? Yeah. Of course, Garmin's now is throwing out all the maps, and the little lady in the box says, turn right, turn left, turn around. Hey, you nincompoop, you're lost. I've turned that one off on the lady. But maps in the old days, before we had Garmin to guide us, were wonderful things, although I did find my daughter looking at one time and saying, Dad, I can't find myself from here to there. And I said, sweetheart, the map's upside down. So it helps to orient the map. But maps are wonderful things. They are abstractions of realities. Maps are abstractions of realities. This is also a map. It's a little different kind of a map. This is not a conceptual map. This is a narrative map. My own belief as a teacher is that humans are visual learners. And we do best with visual learning. And so map making is quite critical at this point. So maps are abstractions. They are not the reality itself. Maps can be very useful in helping one to see the whole or the big picture if you get the right sort of map. Obviously, there are many kinds of maps. Our map is a broad one that seeks to map the whole Bible in terms of the theme of justice, paying attention to the narrative, literary, and social contours of that world. Maps can be tested to see if they fit the terrain. Can I tell you a little story? Aren't you ready for a story? When I was a student at St. Andrews, I had a friend who came over from America, and he called me up and he said, let's go hill walking. I said, I've never done it. He said, well, buy a pair of boots. And I bought a pair of boots, got them one size too big, so I paid for that with a very large blister. But we went up into the Scottish Highlands, which is a marvelous place to go. And we took a map with us. Very one of these detailed survey ordnance maps, tells you where every post is and pit and drain and so on. A wonderful sort of map. And he had a compass, and he had taught map reading as a Marine. All right, so I thought, piece of cake. So up this thing we went. Took us about 4 or 5 hours to get up to it. And on the map, way out at the edge, after we came down off a plain and into a valley, was an inn. And we could see it with logs and a crackling fire and pots of tea and hot buttered toast and scones. And man, by the time we'd walked 6 hours, my feet were almost crippled, and I could hardly wait to get to the end. We got to the end. It was a pile of stones. It was on the map. But the map had forgotten to tell us it was a disused inn. Boy, did my faith in maps go down. And I've always been a little bit suspicious. Have you ever been taken by a map to a road that didn't exist? Or have you ever found a road that was there, you were standing on it, but it wasn't on the map? Yeah, so maps, maps are only as good as they reflect the reality of the terrain. So the map that I'm drawing for you, you want to take it back and reread the scriptures with it, and not make the scriptures fit into the map, but ask, does the map depict the terrain, or are there new bits and pieces that need to modify the map? And I must tell you, every morning when I get up, I tweak the map a little bit. All right? So the truth that I'm telling you this year will be out of date next year. But that's next year. We won't worry about it. Today's truth sufficient thereunto, right? But you need to buy new maps every year. Obviously, the map is made by the map maker, who in this case happens to be me. I did not find the map in the scriptures. I didn't find the map in the scriptures. I have constructed the map out of the scriptures. Now, hopefully, I've really used the building materials of the scriptures and let them stay in their natural state and not done things to them that you shouldn't do, but I've tried to construct the map out of those materials. Hopefully the map corresponds to what one finds in Scripture about justice does not leave out too many streets and does not invent too many streets, parks, and inns that aren't there. The making of this map, this bringer of justice model, is first to enable us to keep in our minds the varied elements of justice and show how they relate to each other. A visual model for most will be much more useful than a list of factors. My sense as a teacher, and I've already said this, is that most humans are visual learners. Also, such a map, once generated, now I want to say this carefully, can be used as a heuristic tool, that is, a way of questioning subsequent sections of the text. But I want to be careful not to use the map to generate meaning. Do you see the difference? I will use the map as I move further, and you'll see me use it right along. I will use the bringer of justice model all the way to the end. And I will use it to generate questions, but hopefully I won't use it to read meaning into the text where it's missing. That would be a misuse of the map. But most important of all is that if we can generate a map and if we can construct a larger bringer of justice model, we will then hopefully be in a position to apply that map to our own world, taking into consideration the difference between the traditional biblical world or worlds and our modern world. In short, maps are meant to guide us on our journey. Maps are meant to guide us on our journey, to help us to arrive at the right destination. My goal, a huge and audacious one, is to generate from the text of the Bible, paying attention to the narrative, the literary, the social context of the story, a map of justice or a bringer of justice model that is sufficiently developed, breadth and depth, to be a major guide in life. And here I say again what I've already said, but let me say it again. In my own struggle with being a missionary, in poverty-stricken countries, rife with injustice as the basic systemic cause of poverty, which results in disease and terrible suffering, I found and still find that the maps which I inherited and which were taught me in college and seminary and graduate school, which I very much respect and honor, were very fragmentary and were not oriented to guiding me as to how to behave in a poverty-stricken world. No one ever produced for me in seminary or Bible college or at that other famous liberal arts college in Wheaton, Illinois, whose name will not be mentioned, a guide to how to behave in a poverty-stricken world. And that was 40 years ago. I think one or two of them have made some stabs at that, but there are not many maps available, and it's still not central to anybody's curriculum. I hope that before I die, I can finish making this map and offer it not only for discussion and debate, I'm interested in the intellectual part, but also, if found to be true, at least in part, to be a guide to behavior for perplexed believers in Jesus, such as myself. So this is a very existential exercise for me. I'm not just doing this because I finished off Matthew and now I need something else to do. No. I'm doing this because I've got unanswered issues, and although I'm living very comfortably in Indianapolis, I cannot get out of my heart and mind what I saw in the Philippines and Kenya. And God help us not to forget that. Now, the bringer of justice model has a number of elements. I said 7. I'm not quite sure that's the right number, although it sounds like a good biblical number. The first one is God, who's the ultimate bringer of justice. Now, we need not go into any detail here about God, the Lord, as the bringer of justice. I'm going to leave that with you because I'm going to skip some things. The next element is promise or programmatic text. So I take what God does. Now, this isn't the only thing he does, but he makes a promise. And of course, we've seen the Genesis 1:28, and we've seen the Genesis 12, and the law is going to be part of that sort of thing. So we've got a promise, a programmatic text, a covenant, a treaty, and these are the things that drive forward and organize the story. The right response to that, and we saw that modeled in Abraham, the right response to God making a promise, to God talking, is faith. All right, and then we come to the humans as bringers of justice. All right, and across this line, these are the human elements of the bringer of justice. I take God to be the major bringer of justice, but that he deigns to work through human bringers of justice, and so at that level are the human bringers of justice. I will include Jesus there, because he comes as a human, doesn't he? And he will fit into that bringer of justice model. When we get to him, we'll talk about Jesus in those terms. Under the humans as bringer of justice, there's both individuals, such as Moses and Joshua and David, to mention just a few, but there's also the people of God, which starts out as Israel. So the bringer of justice can be individual, it can be corporate, and the individual and the corporate have a relationship, which we'll talk about. So the agent can either be an individual or it can be a corporate entity. They do have titles. I think the fundamental title is servant. The most common title for the agent of God is servant. Moses sees himself as servant and is called my servant. Moses, my servant, and so on and so forth. Moses labels Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as your servants. Later, David calls himself servant. We'll see that. I think that's a pretty common title. The servant one. But we also have a number of others, and I will try to pick them up as they relate to justice. Shepherd clearly is one of those. The title shepherd is clearly implied in Numbers 27:17, and presumably would have applied to Moses in his role and then to Joshua. The wording sheep without a shepherd will echo throughout the story, as we will discover. So I'm going to quote here Numbers 27, may the Lord, the God of the spirits of all mankind, appoint a man over this community. This is Moses appointing Joshua, to go out and come in before them, who will lead them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's people will not be like a sheep without a shepherd, or to put it positively, they need a shepherd. And we will find that the language of shepherd and the language of justice are very tightly intertwined, not only in the biblical text, but interestingly enough, in the text of the ancient Near East, where the kings are almost unanimously pictured as shepherds who bring justice. So that's a fairly well-known metaphor, and we'll come back to that. Footnote, when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, all right. Israel is also called my people, my son, and later they'll be called my servant. Now, the task. I think that when we talk, I'm still under agent here, I mean, that's a little misleading. I still think that when we talk about agents and tasks, that the proper focal point is not the titles, and you can work on titles for God and titles for the servants. I think the better unifying point is to talk about the task, which is justice bringing. So I'm going to leave that with you, and although I will come back and I will indeed pay attention to titles of the justice bringers, including the titles of Jesus when we get to that, I think the real focal point is the task, and it's the task which unifies. Now, enablement. How am I, and I'm putting it personally, as a bringer of justice, going to be enabled to do this? The first step, clearly, is faith. And this, of course, is where Israel failed. They didn't have faith in God because the spies brought us a report back, and they were discouraged by that, and they lacked faith in God. Joshua and Caleb had faith. Abraham had faith. And faith is the foundation for all of this. Also, wisdom is there, and we find that Joshua receives wisdom. I'm not going to take time to read that text to you, but we'll come back and think more about wisdom as we go along. Top of page 7. The third thing that is there is spirit. We have already seen that when Moses needed assistance, 70 men were selected, and the Spirit was given to them. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take the Spirit that is upon you, Moses, and put the Spirit on them, the 70, and they will carry your burden of the people so that you will not have to carry it alone. The burden there was juridical, that is judging, and so this is a Spirit that enables them to do justice work. Then the Lord came down in a cloud and spoke with him, And he took the Spirit that was upon him and put the Spirit on the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, but did not do so again. And then a little later on, we get the idea of Joshua also having the Spirit. I simply say as a footnote, I think that probably, without a whole lot of discussion, that besides faith, which we could place down here also, that the real enablement is Spirit. If we're talking about what runs through the Scripture, and we'll pay attention to that. But there's also motivation, and so I put motivation and enablement together. They're distinguishable but not separable, and the motivation to do justice is mercy and love if you're doing distributive justice, but if you're doing retributive justice, the motivation is wrath and anger. So far, not much has been said about mercy or love or wrath and anger of the human agent as bringers of justice. But texts like Exodus 34, 6, and 7, and its repetition in Numbers 14, which we looked at great length, have given the reader an expanded vision of the Lord's mercy, kindness, and love. The Lord, motivated by mercy and love and kindness, forgave Israel, although this forgiveness did not exclude the punishment of sin. And because he's motivated by love and kindness, he continued to hold on to Israel and to maintain his covenant of love in spite of Israel's wickedness. And on the basis of this covenant, the Lord promised to do wonders as they entered the land. Apparently, mercy and love are not directly associated with Moses as a bringer of justice. I found that as a bit of a surprise. But God is motivated to do his justice by mercy and justice, and by mercy and love. And later we'll find other bringers of justice who are motivated to cross over boundary lines to bring justice to the marginals. On the other hand, wrath and anger are attributed to the Lord and led to his executing retributive justice against the wrongdoers, or at least threatening to do so. So Moses sings of the anger of the Lord that led him to execute retributive justice against Pharaoh's army at the Red Sea. Your right hand, O Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging sea stood firm like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. Note that a few stanzas later, love is mentioned as the motivation of the Lord to lead the people to your holy dwelling place. In your unfailing love, Hesed, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling place. So, returning to wrath and anger, it is noteworthy that the only time that the anger of the Lord is mentioned in terms of commandments is the one to do with marginals. Do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. You and your wives will become widows, and so on. Now, I want to connect this then and say that the performance of mighty acts, of which there are retributive acts and distributive acts then, and if we add mercy here, and if we add wrath here, that wrath propels God to carry out retributive justice, and that mercy, love, propels God to carry out restorative justice. I think I got my lines a little confused there, but you get the idea. Now, let me make a statement that I hope will help you. It helps me in sorting this out. What's the important thing to do? And most people will say love. I think that's the wrong answer. Now, please don't go out here and say, you know, that Wood guy said that love's really... No, I didn't say that. I'm going to say this very carefully. The center of God's passion and heart is justice. What motivates God to carry out justice is wrath against the oppressor, all right? And it's mercy and love to lift up and to deliver the oppressed. But justice is the work of God. Love or wrath is the motivation. And I don't want to confuse the task of God with the motivation for the task. All right? I don't want to do that. And so when it comes to doing ethics, I cannot substitute love for justice. They're different things. Love is not a substitute for justice. Love is the motive for doing justice. Huh? Are you with me? You still awake? It's 12 o'clock. I'm starved. Aren't you hungry? This talk has gone on far too long. I wish someone would end it. I think I've probably done what I can with you. On page 9, you see the task there. I've drawn it out. We've already talked about the task, so I don't need to do that again. The recipients are either the guilty, the innocent, or they're the oppressors. There's two kinds of recipients, and so there's two kinds of justice. Top of page 10, and I'm just skating through this. The results of all this is the formation of a just society. And at the bottom of page 10, I've tried to put together in a horizontal fashion the bringer of justice model. You can read the notes. You can see how this works. Let me just finish the chart over here and say, so the agent who believes in God, is filled with the Spirit, has mercy, has wrath. And we'll come back to that, but I think wrath is an essential ingredient in bringing justice. If you don't have wrath in your life, you can't be a justice bringer. All right? If you don't have wrath, if you don't get angry about evil, you can never bring justice. Jesus got absolutely furiously angry about the evil that he saw at the temple, didn't he? And we all sort of blink and say, oh dear, that's not the Jesus we follow, is it? Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. No. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, went in with a whip and did damage. He exercised violence on people. And so anger is a very essential ingredient to carrying out the task of bringing mighty acts, proclaiming law, proclaiming tabernacle, proclaiming justice, building a just society. They all come together. They're all done justly. They form a one witness to the outsiders, the recipients. And the result of that is that a new just society, which is the ultimate goal, is formed. Responses to that, there are negative and positive responses. You can see I'm going to fit things in my chart. But at least I've built a closet for you where you can hang some things, all right? It's a rather sophisticated closet, but never mind. You can hang some things. And so hopefully as we now proceed through the rest of the story of justice, I will stay with the story, and I will work with the story as story. I will work with the story as literature. I will work with the story as social world, especially social world. But I will always come back and ask, and what do we know then about justice as a model for behavior, as a model for understanding, and as a model for driving our behavior? What do we know about that?